Boa tarde a todos e todas, nossos ouvintes do evento do CEVE, mais um último dia do evento, sempre um prazer estar aqui. Eu sou o Vitor Bianconi Menini e hoje estou aqui para mediar a sexta conferência, intitulada, uma tradução livre em português, Amazonas do Norte, Mulheres, Armas e Guerra no Mundo Viking, que será proferida pelo professor Dr. Leszek Gardeła, que é doutor em arqueologia pela Universidade de Aberdeen, e pesquisador de pós-doutorado pelo Museu Nacional da Dinamarca. Eu também vou apresentá-lo em inglês e já vou passar a palavra para ele. Gostaria de dizer que as questões podem ser formuladas no chat, em português ou inglês, e caso feitas em português, eu farei a tradução para o nosso professor. So, the sixth conference of this event is entitled Amazons of the North, Women, Weapons, and Warfare in the Viking World by Professor Leszek Gardeła, doctor in archaeology by the University of Aberdeen and postdoctoral researcher at the National Museum of Denmark. Professor Gardeła, I would like to welcome you and say that I'm very excited for your conference. So thank you very much for the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation as well. I will now share my PowerPoint. I hope you can all see this PowerPoint now. Okay, so I think we can start. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good evening or good afternoon, and welcome to my today's lecture entitled Amazons of the North, Women, Weapons, and Warfare in the Viking World. I'm very happy to be here with you today. It's actually my first time in Brazil, although in a virtual online form.
Excuse me, Professor Leszek, sorry.
Yes?
We cannot see your screen, so I think you need to press the share.
All right.
The screen.
Now, hopefully.
Yes, now we are going to.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Great. So if everything is working now and if everyone is on board, I think we are ready to start. I will begin my lecture with this image. You can see a group of warriors clad in helmets and coats of mail, armed with swords. And this is more or less the kind of picture that often springs to mind when an average person thinks about the Viking Age today. This is also how traditional 19th and early 20th century scholarship viewed this period in history as a time of constant struggle and warfare, and a time dominated by brave, bearded, and muscular men who launched themselves fearlessly into the fray, into the battle. In those traditional approaches to the Viking Age, women were believed to have lived in the shadow of men. There was a conviction among some scholars that women did not really have much to say in the wider arena, and that they were confined to the household and engaged mainly in domestic activities such as spinning, weaving, cooking, taking care of children, and so on. They didn't have much to say. A wind of change in the perception of the Vikings and the Viking Age came in the 1980s and 1990s, a time when a number of groundbreaking studies on the Viking Age appeared. Books by researchers such as Judith Jesch, Jenny Jones, Lotte Motz, and others cast a new light on women's roles and helped to bring them back from the shadows. And from that point onwards, Viking Age women were no longer invisible. They came finally to the fore. Remarkably, a number of studies that were published in the 1980s and 1990s mentioned textual sources in Latin and Old Norse that speak very vividly about women who engaged in martial activities. And one of the most popular and most frequently cited medieval authors was the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, who in the 12th and 13th century wrote very passionately about female warriors in his work. And it's worth citing a passage from Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus to illustrate how fascinated in one way he was with these women. He writes that there were once women in Denmark who dressed themselves to look like men and spent almost every minute cultivating soldiers' skills. They did not want the sinews of their valor to lose tautness and be infected by self-indulgence. Loathing a dainty style of living, they would harden body and mind with toil and endurance, rejecting the fickle pliancy of girls and compelling their womanish spirits to act with virile ruthlessness. They courted military celebrity so earnestly that you would have guessed they had unsexed themselves. Those especially who had forceful personalities or were tall and elegant embarked on this way of life. As if they were forgetful of their true selves, they put a roughness before allure, aimed at conflicts instead of kisses, tasted blood, not lips, sought the clash of arms rather than the arm's embrace, and fitted to weapons hands which should have been weaving, desired not the couch, but the kill, and those they could have appeased with looks, they attacked with lances. Although Saxo's description is very vivid and detailed, most researchers of the 1980s and 1990s did not really treat it very seriously. And they were also convinced that Saxo included warrior women in his history of Denmark only to entertain his audience. And moreover, that he was largely influenced by classical authors, antique authors who wrote about Amazons, authors such as Herodotus, for instance. But as the time went by, the image of the armed woman, shield maiden or Valkyrie, if you like, started to gain a strong foothold in mass media. International audiences could encounter Viking warrior women in comic books and movies and TV series and so on. And these women were all portrayed as brave and courageous individuals, and they were in no way lesser than men. However, solid evidence for the actual existence of warrior women beyond the pages of medieval manuscripts was still lacking in Viking archaeology. A real game changer was the reinterpretation of one of the richest graves discovered in the Viking Age cemetery at Birka in central Sweden. A study published in 2017 showed that as a result of genetic analyses, the occupant of the grave BJ581, formerly hailed as the iconic example of a Viking Age male warrior, was actually biologically female. Unsurprisingly, this launched an avalanche of debates, both in the scholarly milieu, but also, and perhaps especially, among the general public. Over the last several years, we have all heard a lot about this grave, and therefore, in my today's talk, I will actually not go into too much detail about this particular example. And instead, I would like to focus on other archaeological finds from across the entire Viking world that are linked to the broader idea of women and weapons. And first and foremost, I would like to discuss the results of my recently completed project, a project called Amazons of the North, like the title of my today's talk. The ultimate goal of the Amazons of the North project, which I conducted at the universities of Bonn and Bergen, was to investigate the various associations between women and weapons in the Viking Age, mainly by taking a holistic approach to all the available sources. So the project therefore consisted of two parts dealing with archaeological and textual material. The archaeological part of the project focused on very comprehensive analyses of Viking Age female graves with weapons and on all kinds of iconographic sources portraying human or supernatural women wielding weapons. The textual part of the project, on the other hand, focused on all kinds of relevant textual sources that mention women with weapons. And this includes, of course, Old Norse sagas, poetry, all kinds of medieval texts that are relevant to the debate. Between June 2018 and June 2019, I worked mainly at the University of Bergen in Norway, and I conducted thorough analyses of several Viking Age female graves with weapons held in Bergen and in different Scandinavian or Norwegian mainly museum collections. And as a result of my analyses, I was able to track down around 30 different examples of possible female graves furnished with weapons or martial equipment, and around 200 examples of small portable objects, figurines, showing armed female, as we believe, figures with all kinds of weapons. And this is, as you can see, quite a lot of data. 200 figurines, around 30 graves. That's a substantial body of material. And in looking at this material, I wanted to better understand the meaning of it, the meaning content of, on the one hand, female weapon graves with weapons, and on the other, those various figurines. And I wanted to find out if weapons really signaled a warrior identity of the dead person. There are, of course, many problems, as you know, with approaching the burial data with finds from graves. So before we take a look at selected examples, I want to give you an idea of what these different problems involve. First of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that many of the graves that potentially belong to women with weapons were discovered many, many years ago, mainly in the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th century. So in approaching them today, we have to pay a very close attention to issues of their documentation and the reliability of the documentation, of the archival material. Ideally, we should also strive to examine the material firsthand, and this is why I worked at museums. I wanted to actually see the objects that I'm talking about in my work. So these were the main kind of methodological principles of my research. This was what guided my research, this concern for being meticulous and source critical and accurate. One thing that we need to always bear in mind when we are approaching Viking Age graves or any other graves from the past is that they are not mirrors of life. They do not reflect reality in an undistorted way. So we should be very careful in reading status or profession or sex or ethnicity based only on the different grave goods that we find. We should also avoid one-sided interpretations in a very traditional spirit, along the lines that weapons always mean that the deceased person is male, or that jewelry always means that the deceased person is a woman. Especially in the absence of any bone material. We should also question the idea that weapons equal warriors and jewelry indicates that the dead person was a prominent lady of the house. We should abandon the idea that the rich grave goods imply that the deceased were rich, or that poor grave goods imply that they were poor. We have to approach these things in a more nuanced, in a more careful way, and this is also something that guided my work. So instead of viewing graves as mirrors, I prefer to see them as mirages of life, as a kind of poetic text that cannot be taken too literally. And in my research, I've been very inspired by the work of scholars like Howard Williams, Neil Price, and Heinrich Herke, and they all emphasize this in their work. Graves are not mirrors of life. Rather, they are mirages or poetic impressions. So, for instance, Heinrich Herke, a German scholar working mainly with Anglo-Saxon material, has argued that grave goods have the capacity to convey all kinds of messages. They can, on the one hand, represent the property of the dead, and they can serve as indicators of status and rank, but at the same time, they can also be sacrifices, metaphors of some bygone events from the life of the deceased or the mourners. They can be seen as gifts to the dead or deities, and so on. There is an infinite, almost infinite world of ideas that can be linked to grave goods and their placement in the graves. So it is with all these methodological reservations and theoretical ideas that we have to approach the concept and the phenomenon of women's graves with weapons, but also men's graves with weapons. We have to have the same standard for approaching also male related archaeology. So I want to show you a couple of case studies, mainly from Norway, that illustrate some of those points and that relate to the idea of women and weapons. Our first study is a grave discovered by a farmer in the year 1900 at a place called Nordre Kjølen in Hedmark in Norway. And this grave contained the skeletal remains of a single person, a single individual, buried together with a horse. Surrounding this person were a number of weapons. There was a sword, an axe, a set of arrowheads, a whetstone, and an iron file. When the bones of the deceased person were later analyzed by an osteologist, it turned out, to everyone's surprise, that the body belonged to a young woman, not to a man. And intriguingly, both in the archaeological report and in the anthropological, osteological assessment of the material, this deceased person was immediately labeled a shield maiden. And although the finds from this grave had been excavated and removed before a professional archaeologist came to the site, the farmer who found the grave was able to explain very precisely how they had been laid out in relation to the body. So in the absence of an in situ grave plan, we can actually reconstruct the original appearance of the grave based on this information provided by the farmer. So you can see it here in this artistic reconstruction by my colleague Mirosław Kuźma. You can see that the weapons were flanking the body of this deceased woman. You can see that the sword was placed by the left side in a very unusual way because the tip of the blade is pointing towards the deceased person's face. This is a way of depositing weapons that is very rare in the Viking world because, as you know, when you have swords in graves, they are usually placed in such a way that the point of the sword is pointing down, it's pointing towards the feet. And in the course of my research, I have actually been able to find a few analogies to this practice. And intriguingly, they all come from Eastern Norway. So this seems to be like an Eastern Norwegian custom more than anything else. And it was something practiced very deliberately. There are reasons to think that such a positioning of the weapon was intended to communicate something very special about the deceased person. If we turn to slightly younger iconographic sources, such as the Bayeux tapestry, for instance, we can see that rulers are often portrayed holding swords in exactly this way. And I think this can be seen as a way of manifesting power and manifesting elevated social status. And perhaps this is how we should perceive the person from that female grave from Norway. Perhaps this emphasizes that she had a particularly prominent position in the society. And at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to indicate that this person was active as a warrior. Maybe it's just a symbol of power, of a prominent social position. Especially in light of the fact that this person from that Norwegian grave was very young, and that her skeleton was very gracile, had a very tender frame. So this is how I would carefully approach this particular grave. My second example is a female grave from a place called Morem in Telemark, also in Norway. And this grave is exceptional in a number of ways. So here the deceased individual, probably a woman, we say probably because no bones have actually survived, was buried with very high status female jewelry, which included 2 oval brooches, a round brooch at the neck, suggesting that the person was dressed in some kind of long dress and had a cape or a shawl around the neck or over the shoulders. You can also notice that this person had as many as 3 different strings of beads. One was worn around the neck, another was suspended from the oval brooches, and then the third one was wrapped or held worn on the wrist, on the right hand. Here's again a reconstruction of how the grave may have appeared at the time of burial. And you can also notice that the woman had a very curious copper alloy tube, which at first glance looks like a needle case, but it was not a needle case. Inside it were actually fragments of gold foil. And this implies that this object was something like a reliquary or an amulet box. And in addition to all these different finds, the woman, as you can see, also had an axe, which was placed by her left hand, and there was also a sickle at the feet. This very rich and unusual assemblage, including as many as 3 strings of beads, which originate from very distant places like Egypt, Syria, Iran, maybe India, the amulet box, an axe, and the sickle all together suggest that rather than being a warrior, this person may have been involved in the practice of magic. Perhaps this person served her society as a kind of ritual specialist, a sorceress, or even a velva, if you like. And I will provide further arguments for this view later on in my talk. My third example now is another female grave from a place called Løve in Vestfold, Norway. And here, this young female individual was buried alongside a possibly decapitated horse. I say possibly decapitated because no head of this animal has survived. By the head of this woman was an axe, and she also had a number of exotic and curated beads. You can see them here in the next slide and in the reconstruction. And on the horse, directly on its body, was a kind of rattle, an instrument, a musical instrument, which is also in Norwegian known as rangle. And this instrument probably had some ritual purpose, was used in ceremonies or processions. So as in the case of the grave from Morem, this complete assemblage of this very particular grave can lead us to believe that this person was not a warrior, even though an axe was buried with her, and not a warrior in a literal sense. And instead, the axe in the grave may have signaled a different role in society. Again, I would argue that this individual may have been some kind of a ritual specialist, a kind of sorceress. There are also other graves in Norway of other character, of other nature, that contain presumed women with weapons. And among them are both inhumations and cremations. I will just show you a few quick examples to to complete this picture of the archaeological material. So one of them is a grave from a place called Aunvollen in Nord-Trøndelag in northern Norway. And this grave was discovered by accident in the 1980s during mechanical digging in a field. It was later professionally excavated by an archaeologist. And after this research, it was revealed that the grave contained a single skeleton, which was then osteologically sexed as a young woman, buried together with a sword, a spear, a sickle, and also a number of other goods that you can see on the plate here. The sword was only partially preserved, so the pommel was missing. Below it, you can see the spearhead. On the right-hand side, you can see scissors or shears, a set of gaming pieces, a whetstone, a sickle, a knife, and also a bone comb. Another example from Norway, from a place called Sandal, is also very interesting. Here, this was a burial of a probable woman, judging by the grave goods, buried with a lot of very rich items: oval brooch, a silver chain, spindle whorls, sickle, horse bits, a whetstone, and again an axe. In this case, an axe of type D, according to the typology of Jan Pettersen. Then there is another grave, also from Western Norway, from Terum, and in this case it's a cremation, and you can see here a selection of objects, a very fragmented oval brooch, a bracelet, and a couple of beads, shears, spindle whorls, chain links, perhaps from a dog leash, and the same grave contained arrowheads and a woodworking axe. You can also see the burned bone, and this is actually all that is left of the skeleton. As you can see, that's not much. But we can speculate that this was a woman's grave with arrowheads, so with something that has martial connotations. So to sum this up, and without going into further detail and into further examples from around the Viking world, we can see that an interesting pattern begins to emerge from these female graves with weapons. Statistically speaking, it appears that the most common type of weapon or a martial-related object buried with women was the axe. Perhaps these axes, some of them were used in warfare, but in most cases, typologically speaking, they cannot be considered as battle axes only. They are more like multifunctional axes. They would as well work very well as household utensils for carpentry, for chopping joints of meat, slaughtering animals, and so on. An axe is a very multifunctional object, and we have to bear this in mind. Most of the axes that we have from those female graves have a very small size, and they have very narrow blades, and this implies that they are multifunctional objects rather than massive axes for killing, slaughtering humans on the battlefield. What is very intriguing, however, is that in many cases, in female graves with axes and other weapons, these weapons are buried in unusual ways, and also with unusual other objects, such as amulets, antiques, exotic goods, and animal sacrifices, as you could see. And all this, taken together, taken collectively, contextually, suggests that these weapons should be seen as objects holding some very special symbolic meaning. Now, the idea that axes in particular had special significance in connection with women is further supported by another grave, a grave discovered at a place called Sphingosetter in Western Norway. Here, a woman was buried in a stone cist in a seated position, something that's actually very unusual by Norwegian Viking Age standards. She also had a set of expensive jewelry there was a wooden chest at her feet, a key, and a very curious miniature axe made of copper alloy. This object may have served the role of a status symbol or an amulet, or alternatively, it could have been something like a fancy clothing pin, something that you could use to fasten a cloak, a shawl around your shoulders, over your shoulders, or around your body. In fact, I found this object really interesting and beautiful, so I commissioned a replica from a modern reenactor and craftsman, so you can see how the replica looks today. And back in the Viking Age, an object like this would have certainly shone beautifully in the sunlit valley, or in a Viking Age hall by the fires of the fireplace in the hall. So it would have been something that would have drawn attention, something people would probably envy. In fact, miniature axes, very similar to this one, are found in various places around the Viking world. But intriguingly, a lot of them are discovered in connection with children, especially in the Eastern Viking areas. And they are often, in those contexts, interpreted as some sort of status symbols, and occasionally as references to warrior ideals that are nurtured by mature warriors. Okay, so now we know that Viking Age women had some special connection with axes. They were occasionally buried with them, with axes in full size and in miniature form. But the question still remains, why? Why were they buried with axes? Why were axes so important in the Viking Age and in connection with women? And as you know, Old Norse literature is sometimes eagerly used to illuminate discussions of Viking Age ritual practices. And I think in this particular case, it can also be used to shed some light on the symbolism of weapons in female hands. A saga known as the Leospat saga, which is a relatively late family saga, can help us in understanding this. And it describes a prophetic ritual which involves a cross-dressing sorceress. In this ritual, the woman wears a helmet, she wears trousers, and she wades into the fjord holding an axe. She then strikes the water twice with her axe, and this act allows her to see the future, to look into the future of her client. I can read this passage for you now. It presents the scene in detail. And as we read in Leospat saga, some time passed, and early one morning, Gudmundur, who is the protagonist of the saga, rode off alone to Vodlar in northern Iceland. Thorhild, who is the sorceress, was outside, dressed in breeches and with a helmet on her head and an axe in her hand. She said to him, "Come with me now, Gudmundur." She headed down to the fjord and seemed to grow in stature. She waded out into the shallows and struck her axe into the water, and Gudmundur could observe no change. Then she came back and said, "I don't think there will be men to take up vengeance against you. You will be able to keep your honor. Now, I would like to know whether my sons will escape reprisal," said Gudmundur. "That's a more onerous task," she said. She then waded out into the shallows and struck a blow in the water. There was a loud crash, and the water turned all bloody. Then she said, "I think, Gudmundur, that the blow will fall close to one of your sons." So, of course, this is a bad omen. Using this axe, hitting the water with the axe has revealed a very unpleasant future for Gudmundur and his sons. But what this account demonstrates is that on some occasions, axes may have been used by women not as weapons, but actually as ritual objects, as ritual accoutrements. Could the axes buried in some of the graves I discussed earlier have been used in a similar way? I think this is a very plausible interpretation, especially when we remember the context of their discovery. In fact, employing axes in magic rituals is very well known from also later folklore, from places like Scandinavia, Finland, and Poland. We find axes that are used to symbolically chop off a sickness that is in like in horror films, literally stuck to a person. You can use an axe to cut this sickness off a person. And in this photo, you can see a man performing exactly this kind of ritual. So this adds yet another intriguing, fascinating angle to the, I would say, transformative nature of axes in the north. In some cases, they can be weapons. In some cases, they can be domestic tools. And in some cases, they can be ritual objects. Finally, I would like to point out that in addition to full-size weapons like axes, swords, and arrowheads, there is actually a substantial corpus of female graves that contains miniature weapons, small-size weapons, in the form of shields. In 2018, together with my colleague from Sweden, Kerstin Öderbeck from Stockholm University, we published a very detailed paper that analyzes the complete corpus of these finds from Northern and Central Europe. We listed quite a lot of specimens, a total of 79 finds from Scandinavia, Poland, and other areas, and another 80 finds from Eastern Europe, so from today's Russia. So this is a very substantial body of material. And it is fascinating to find out that actually quite a number of these miniature shields come from graves that contain other special objects, other kinds of amulets, for instance. And in this slide, you can see 3 such graves from Birka in Sweden, all belonging probably to women, judging by the presence of oval brooches, for instance. But the bottom line here is that these amulets have martial connotations, but the graves in which they are found don't contain any full-size weapons. So there are no grounds to suggest that these women buried with miniature shields were warriors in life. That would be a stretch, I think. A very interesting grave of a woman buried with a miniature shield was also found in Norway. It's actually the only Norwegian grave that has a miniature shield. And it was discovered at a place called Flakstad in Hedmark in eastern Norway. Here, in addition to the miniature shield, the woman also had a very expensive array of cooking utensils, including a frying pan and a bronze ladle. But she also had what we call a trefoil brooch, so a brooch that has these 3 lobes. And what is interesting about brooches of this kind, which are in the Viking Age a standard type of female jewelry, is that they link to much earlier objects and much earlier traditions, and they appear as part of military equipment in the Carolingian world. They originally served as strap distributors or strap dividers for swords carried by men. So here you can see an example of a sort of cultural appropriation of older objects and using them in a Viking Age context, and also using them by women, not men. Men did not wear brooches of this very particular kind. What is interesting to note is that aside from the burial finds, women with weapons also feature quite prominently in Viking Age iconography. So before I conclude this talk, I want to show you a couple of examples of this particular phenomenon. And some of you following Facebook sites and reading articles on Viking Age archaeology will know that there is a rapidly expanding corpus of so-called double figurines that portray an armed rider and a standing figure. Conventionally, Viking Age scholars have interpreted these images as representations of Valkyries. But as I would argue, there are other interpretations of this scene that are equally plausible and equally possible. If we look more closely at these finds, we will see that they are very rich in detail. You can see on this enlarged image a knotted ponytail, a helmet or some elaborate hairstyle, a cape, baggy trousers, shield, a possible spur, a horn, yet another shield, and a strange 9-field square underneath the horse's belly, perhaps a gaming board or some kind of banner. What is interesting about it is that it always has 9 fields, and as you probably know, the number 9 was very important, very significant in the Viking world. In order to try and understand what this scene depicts, we can try and link its different details with surviving textual sources. One of them is a poem from the Poetic Edda known as Grimnismal, which contains a description of Freya's otherworldly domain called Folkvanger. And it could be the case that this scene represents a scene happening somewhere in Folkvanger, a Freya figure welcoming a fallen warrior in her own equivalent of Odin's Valhalla. But admittedly, this is a bit of a stretch here in this scene, so it has to remain a speculation. But I think a more plausible reading is that this scene refers to a very well-known story that circulated very widely around the Viking world, namely the story of Sigurd and Brunhild. In this story, we have a motif where Sigurd rides over a wall of shields or a wall of fire to wake up a sleeping Valkyrie called Brunhild. And upon waking up, she offers him, after waking up, she offers him a drink. And perhaps this is exactly what this scene shows. Sigurd on the horse, holding his sword, as we know that he held a sword in the stories, riding to see a Valkyrie, to see Brunhild, who welcomes him with a cup. Of course, these are just 2 of many possible interpretations, and it may be the case that these images are not linked to any mythological story that has survived, that has come down to us in surviving texts. Maybe they refer to something else. Maybe different people in different places around the Viking world had different ideas of what this scene represented. We always have to be open to alternative readings. What is noteworthy is that in addition to these double figurines, there are also single ones. And likewise, they can be interpreted in various ways. They can be interpreted as Valkyries, but they can also be interpreted as, for instance, images of ancestors and maybe even images of actual women who on some occasions would have taken up arms for this or that purpose. In trying to better understand the different motivations that may have led Norse women to reach for weapons, I think it's very stimulating to look beyond the Nordic world. And while working on the Amazons project, I actually read numerous books on armed women in past and present times. Here's just a selection of some of those that I particularly enjoyed, some of the core studies into the topic. And somewhat surprisingly, also for me actually, is one of the most relevant studies that I read was a book called The Tradition of Female Transvestism in Early Modern Europe, which discusses female cross-dressers from the 16th and 18th century Dutch Republic. It was a time when the Republic was an international sea empire. So in some ways, it was not very far removed from its much earlier Viking Age counterparts in places like Denmark or Norway or Sweden. And the book is interesting because based on legal records from trials against female cross-dressers, the authors conclude that there were actually 4 key motivations that led the women to dress up as men. These were romantic motivations, patriotic motivations, economic motivations, and criminal motivations. And if you take these 4 motivations and compare them to what the sagas of different genres tell us about women reaching for weapons, you can see quite a lot of overlap: romantic, economic, criminal, patriotic, and so on. In reading about these comparative cases of women warriors, I also found a book by Amber Smith called Danger Close, which describes the author's life as a combat helicopter pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan, a really thrilling read. And at one point in her book, which I'm highlighting here below, she writes how, as a child, she was very thrilled with all the wartime stories told by her dad, who was also a soldier in his time. And Amber Smith says that when she heard her father's stories, it sounded exciting to jump out of airplanes, talk all the way the army guys talked, like pass the salt please, and to be an overall badass paratrooper. He jumped out of airplanes, shot machine guns, and camped in the woods. It all sounded like an incredible adventure. I was awestruck by my dad's experiences and told myself that someday, I would join the army just like he had. Now, I want you to take this passage and substitute airplanes for ships, paratroopers for Vikings, and machine guns for swords, and you might actually get an idea of how some young Viking age girls, especially from elite circles, might have felt when their Viking fathers talked about their Viking adventures overseas. It's not really far removed, I think. So to conclude, based on the archaeological and textual sources that we reviewed above, it appears that weapons in Viking Age female graves and in other contexts had many different meanings. And in interpreting them, I think we must always pay very close attention not only to their material aspects or to the fact that they are weapons, but also to their wider contexts. And we need to be conscious and aware of the very specific and very deliberate ways in which these weapons were deposited in these different graves. And as I have demonstrated, I think axes are the most common weapons in Viking Age female graves, but their interpretation is never straightforward. Other contexts and contents of these graves give reasons to believe that rather than being weapons per se, these axes could have served as symbols of status or perhaps even as ritual tools. Likewise, miniature weapons can be interpreted in a whole number of ways. So, for example, as status symbols, as amulets providing some kind of protection, perhaps for or from the dead, or even as emblems or symbols of group affiliation. In general, I would argue, it seems that women buried with weapons in Viking Age Scandinavia, at least as far as we can tell today from the graves that we have, were not actual and active warriors. Weapons in their graves rather served to emphasize other aspects of their lives, and perhaps death as well, and referred to their important roles as prominent farm owners, as leaders, even leaders of warriors in some cases, or ritual specialists. Or the weapons could have alluded to very crucial events from their life. And in some cases, I think weapons in female graves may have also alluded to mythical stories, because the Viking world was saturated with stories and with myths. So I will end here. So thank you so much for listening. If you would like to learn more or read more about it, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at my recently released book. There is an American edition and there's also a European edition. It's called Women and Weapons in the Viking World, Amazons of the North. So if you want more detail, you're very welcome to check out this book. It's an academic study, but I hope it is written in an accessible way. So if you're not a professional scholar, I hope you will be able to read it and enjoy it. So I will end here. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for listening. You're of course very welcome to ask questions or to also privately write to me, send me an email on my email address or on my social media. I will try my best to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Gardeła. That was a great presentation. We have many questions. I will do my best to organize them and present them in English for you. Some of them are quite long, but I'm sure we can manage that. I'll leave my own questions for later, but for first, we have a question by Caio Felipe. He's asking about being the Viking Age, a period of time when war was just a very important part of their lifestyle. Is it possible to see women, and you just said about that, is it possible to see women having military functions as strategists and war leaders? So you just mentioned that. So if you could explore that a little more, I think it would be contemplating that.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a very good question, and I also discussed this in quite a lot of detail in my book that I showed on the last slide. There are actually a couple of examples from textual sources that mention women in exactly this role, where they don't actively participate in battle, holding weapons and actively fighting and hacking, slashing the enemy, but when they're standing somewhere farther away and just directing the army. So one example is taken from Nestor's Chronicle, or Primary Chronicle, and it talks about the Princess Olga of the Rus, and she was a leader, a military leader of exactly this kind, devising strategies and military campaigns. Another one is Ethelfled, the daughter of Alfred the Great, who also had a very similar role. She is mentioned as someone who was responsible for sort of supervising the building of fortifications and so on, but she is never, in surviving texts at least, portrayed as an active warrior. So yes, I think the answer is yes. In this role, we can see women being very active and having certainly a lot to say in the sphere of war.
Absolutely. So before I jump to the other great questions, I think that my own question can relate to that. It is about, so you're conducting research in a museum, and I'm really interested in how to present these findings and studies as a part of this new museology. So how to present this data about women and with weapons in a context that's not only bellical. So that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's, as I showed in my PowerPoint, there's a lot of material out there, and of course, I think the way to present this is to present it in a nuanced way. You have to kind of steer away from showing women's graves with weapons and just labeling them as, for instance, warrior graves. You have to present this as one of several possible interpretations, and kind of ask questions and allow the viewers to decide for themselves. Give them space for their own interpretation, but guide this interpretation in one way or another, showing what is probable and what is not probable. What I try to do in my PowerPoint, I also try to give you all an idea of how difficult this material is to interpret. As you could see, a lot of the finds come from the 19th century, the 20th century. In many cases, we say these are women's graves, but we actually don't know for sure, because all we have is metal objects that are linked to women, like brooches and so on, and we don't have bones. Actually, very few of those graves can be positively osteologically or genetically or biologically sexed as the graves of women. In many cases, we can actually say the same about male graves, because a lot of male graves are sexed as male because they have objects that we conventionally associate with men. It could be the case that at least some of the graves that we think are male are actually the graves of women.
Sure, absolutely.
It can also, you cannot have double standards when you're looking at this material. So when I say I am hesitant to interpret female graves with weapons as graves of warriors, I say the same thing about male graves. I also don't think every man buried with a sword was a warrior. I think many, or maybe even most of them, were not.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I will jump for the next question. It's by Alessandro Carvalho. Is asking about actually archaeological material concerning to the fact that if there are any findings, archaeological findings of women being buried in ships, as there are some in some cases for men. So he's trying to understand that, or if this kind of ritual was perpetrated for only male warlords or anything. So that's the first part of the question. I can come back to that later.
Yes, of course. Women are buried in ships and in boats. It varies across space and time. And this tradition of ship burial is actually quite common in Norway. So we have a lot of the graves that are known from the Norwegian Viking Age material are actually ship or boat graves. In Western Norway, these graves can belong to both men and women, and they are all very rich. So these were all people of, we could speculate at least that these are all people of high status, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were all or warriors or warlords and so on. The ship, the boat, was something they would have needed and used on a regular basis, especially in a landscape that is surrounded by water. With rivers and lakes and fjords, you need ships like any other vehicle to move from point A to point B.
Sure, great. So we have now a question by Professor Luciana, who is from CEVE. It's a quite long question, very interesting. She's very interested in the topic. So the question starts with some legendary sagas, such as the Hervor saga, which was subject of her doctoral thesis, features emblematic female characters who showed no fear or cowardice in the face of any situation. In many cases, terrified men as well. These women, such as Hervor, who actually ordered a sword of the family, adopts a masculine name and clothes, or even Freydis, who faces in the man's flight and even pregnant in battle. So this kind of situation, these female characters having this virility and warlike spirit. So the question is, were these characteristics common to the medieval Nordic women, or a literary product to please this male audience?
That's a very interesting, great question. One thing that's really interesting about those different portrayals of women and weapons in texts is that if you look at family sagas, or the so-called Islendinga saga, they mention women wielding weapons or reaching for weapons on some occasions. But these women who reach for weapons, they are never active warriors. They only pick weapons to defend themselves, to defend their honor, to manifest something. So in situations of crisis. Whereas in a different genre, so in the legendary sagas that you mentioned, for instance, Hervarar saga, we have female warriors sort of par excellence. And what is really interesting about them is that they all, I think, come from elite circles. These are all daughters of kings or jarls. In the case of Hervor, she's also from an elite environment, you could say. Her father was a famous berserker. So I think there could be a grain of truth in these stories. Because if we take the sagas on one side and we take other medieval texts that mention women, such as those that I talked about earlier, those about Olga or Ethelfled, they also come from elite circles. And as we know, in many societies, if you belong to the upper echelons of a society, you can do more and you can transgress certain boundaries that normal people cannot. So to me, at least, it would have been possible for some women from those circles who grew up in those particular circumstances to do something extraordinary. And this is what those women of the sagas do. However, what is interesting is that in most cases, those women of the sagas cannot become warriors as women. They have to take up, as you mentioned, they have to take up a masculine name. They have to dress themselves in a different way. So they have to somehow conceal their identity. And this, if you read this book that I mentioned about female transvestites in the Netherlands, this is exactly what women back in the day would also do to change their life, to do something else. They also had to cross-dress and pretend to be someone else. Otherwise, it could lead to very serious consequences. So these women would be subject to public ostracism or even imprisonment, and in some cases, even death. It was a career, definitely a possible career path, but a difficult one and a potentially dangerous one.
Absolutely. I'll pick up on this. I will call it the gender relation between iconography and women and warlike spirit stuff. And André Oliveira has a great question. First, he congratulated you by the conference, which was great for him, and he wants a better explanation or exploration on the different social differentiation between visual identity in women in Viking Age, especially concerning this ornamentation that you mentioned that sometimes is found in the graves, and even in the 2D miniatures that you mentioned. So how to understand this visual identity in that scenario?
A very, very good question. Also a kind of methodological question. How can we say the things we are saying about them? One of my approaches always when I look at iconography, for example, is I try to see as much as possible. I strive to see as much as possible and to ideally examine every find that we have at this moment. So in looking at these miniatures, for example, we are actually together with my colleague Peter Pence at the National Museum of Denmark and with Professor Neil Price, we're actually completing now a big iconographic study of these images. And one of our methods was to actually go and see the finds, have very high quality photographs to see the different positions they are in, the different attributes they carry, to find patterns, find things that link them or distinguish them from one another. And in some cases, our interpretations are also guided by textual sources, by sagas and poetry. So this is one of the ways of looking at this material. I don't want to reveal too much from a study that's not yet published, but one thing that's very striking is that in these figurines, they seem to be holding weapons in awkward or strange ways. Those single figurines that you saw on my slides hold shields in ways that you wouldn't normally hold a shield in battle. So, for instance, they hold the shields with the shield boss positioned towards the body, under the arm. That's not how you carry a shield if you want to fight. And as you remember from the graves that I showed you, those female graves, weapons in those graves are also in strange positions. Axes placed by the head or a sword pointing towards the face. These things also connect on some metaphorical level, indicating maybe that weapons are not always weapons. They can be something else. They can communicate something else.
Absolutely. I have two more questions right now. One is concerning the archaeological findings of the burials. And the question is relating to, is it possible to investigate the bones of these women to look for any battle damages or broken bones that were allegedly maybe in battlefields, to then suppose that they were actual or not actual war figures? So that's the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. As of today, we have absolutely no evidence of any battle trauma on the bones, on the surviving bones. The bones from the famous Birka grave, BJ581, they don't carry any trauma inflicted in battle. The other skeletons are very poorly preserved, so we cannot really say much. In those cases where there's a little bit more bone material, there is just nothing to suggest this. I know that there has been some speculation about the Norwegian grave from Nordresjælland, that there is some sort of indentation on the skull, but this has never been sort of properly investigated or published in a peer-reviewed journal, only mentioned in a TV documentary. It can be right, but you have to approach it with caution at this moment. But at the same time, I think, of course, if you have battle trauma on the bones, this can indicate that someone lived their life as a warrior. But we know that there are many ways you can die in battle, and many wounds that you can suffer that don't affect bone. And you can have wounds to the flesh and just bleed yourself to death, and that doesn't leave any traces on the bone material. And if you look at male graves with weapons that we kind of speculate that they belong to men, they also rarely carry battle wounds. So this just shows that, on the one hand, it can show that maybe those buried with weapons were not warriors, but it can also show that people died in many different ways, also in battle.
Thank you. So one more question here by Caio Felipe. It's relating to symbolic uses of weapons, especially the case of witchcraft. So he's asking about the connection between the witchcraft of the vulvas and the weapons in the burials. So if you can talk a little more about that, would be great.
Very nice, very, very nice question, very interesting question. So I mentioned the axe and the use of axes in rituals. And the best source for that we have is the Leospat Ninga Saga that I cited. So the story about a sorceress using an axe in a prophetic ritual where she wades into the fjord and she hits the fjord with the weapon. But other graves of presumed velvas or female sorceresses also have weapons. And that's a very interesting pattern. So graves that have so-called magic staffs or these long iron sticks sometimes have weapons as well, especially in Norway. And these can be shield bosses. In some cases, there are also arrowheads in those graves or objects that look like spears or spearheads. So that's a very interesting pattern, and this does not make those women warriors necessarily, but it can indicate that they used weapons in some of their rituals, perhaps. I would even maybe speculate or go as far as to suggest that some of these ritual specialists dressed up or reenacted figures that we know from Old Norse mythology. Maybe they even reenacted, or in the course of a funeral or another ritual, reenacted Valkyries, and then carrying a spear would have been quite appropriate. There are actually 3 graves from Denmark where we have good reasons to believe that they belonged to velvas or other ritual specialists that all contain spear-like objects. One of them is the very famous grave from Firkat on Jutland. And it's your sort of iconic Völva grave, the King Harald's sorceress, as some people call it. And this woman was buried in the body of a wagon. She had an iron staff, all kinds of amulets. And by her side, there was also a long iron rod that looks very much like a spit for roasting. But this iron rod terminates with the blade of a spear. And intriguingly, it's positioned in such a way that it's pointing towards the feet. Whereas normally, when you have spears in graves, they're pointing up and they're placed by the head. The 2 other graves that are relevant here, one is from a place called Gerdrup on Zealand. And here you have a man and a woman, and the woman is crushed with stones. So this links with all these stories of sorcerers from the sagas who get stoned to death. And she also has a spear by her side. And like in Firkat, the spear is at the feet pointing down. And then the third grave is also a grave from Zealand, from a place called Trekkrona. And here, again, a woman buried with a horse also has a pointy copper alloy object by her right hand pointing down that looks very much like a spear, but could actually be a spear staff kind of thing. So yeah, we have certain connections between female magicians, if you like,
Sure.
and the weapons.
Great. So, Dr. Gardeła, I would like to thank you very much for the conference. It was a great pleasure to be here with you and listen to your presentation. In the name of NEVE, I would like to also thank you for participating, and I look forward to keep in touch and keep exchanging scholarship with you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you all enjoyed it. And as I said, if you have some questions, please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to help. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Pessoal, aqui em português para fechar, a continuidade final, então, continuem ligados no evento, temos ainda comunicações e mesas, será um prazer tê-los com vocês ainda nesse último dia de evento. Agradecemos a participação e até a próxima. Muito obrigado.